As a journalist trained in law, I'm especially attuned to this phenomenon of fake news. That is, reports that seem persuasive at first, but which turned out to be based on half-truths or outright falsehoods once they're examined more carefully. And believe it or not, even Christmas has been victimized by fake news. For instance, if you peruse the internet or read books by certain skeptics, you're bound to see the charge that Christmas, with its virgin birth of Jesus, is actually based on similar legends and mystery religions that came before Christ. In other words, Christianity is merely a copycat religion that plagiarized this idea of the incarnation from earlier mythology. And therefore, it's only really as valid as the fanciful tales about Zeus or Perseus. Thomas Jefferson said in 1823, "The day will come when the mystical generation of Jesus by the Supreme Being as his Father, in the womb of a virgin, will be classed with the fable of the generation of Minerva in the brain of Jupiter." A contemporary skeptic put it this way: "The notion that Jesus had no human father because he was the Son of God was originally a pagan notion. Gentiles in pagan culture expect a man whose life embodied divinity to have a divine father and a human mother. The virgin birth thus corresponds to what Gentile Christians expected in a biography of Jesus." But is all of that true? Is Christmas really built on mythology? Was the idea of a virgin birth merely appropriated from earlier legends or tall tales? Or does it stand on a solid foundation of historical truth? Let's take a deeper look at all of this. In this session, we're going to dig beneath the fake news and get to the real story about the birth of Jesus. This is going to be fun. This is going to be like my old newspaper days. Several years ago, the novel The Da Vinci Code popularized this mantra: "Nothing in Christianity is original." Now, even though it was a work of fiction, the book claimed that its underlying religious assertions were true. And the novel reported that Christianity is a copycat religion that stole its essential beliefs, including the virgin birth of Jesus, from earlier mythology, legends, and so-called mystery religions. Like a lot of fake news, the case sounded convincing at first. For example, critics say there were stories of an earlier mythological god named Mithras, long before Jesus was born. Did you know that Mithras was born of a virgin in a cave on December the 25th and had 12 disciples? He sacrificed himself for world peace. He was buried in a tomb, and he rose again 3 days later. Now, does that sound familiar? I mean, could this mystery religion called Mithraism be the real source for Christian beliefs about Christmas and Easter? What about legends that the god Zeus actually fathered Alexander the Great? Or that Buddha was born of a virgin? Oh, and Krishna too. It seems there was a proliferation of virgin births well before the story of Jesus' virginal conception. All of this can be very troubling when you first hear it, except that it's fake news. It reminds me of what Proverbs 18:17 says. "The one who states his case first seems right, until the other comes and examines him." Now, in the same way, fake news often comes across as convincing until we go to a reliable fact-checking website where the initial claim is subjected to rigorous investigation and cross-examination. And often, that's when we recognize that the original news was, well, it was exaggerated or even outright fabricated. So let's do our own fact-checking. Let's look into the claims about this mythological Mithras. What do we find when we examine the record more thoroughly? Well, we discover that he wasn't born of a virgin. Such a claim was never made. Instead, the myth says that Mithras emerged fully grown out of a rock, and he was wearing a hat. No virgins and no caves. Besides, as we said in the last session, the idea that Jesus was born in a cave is nowhere in the New Testament anyway. Was there a claim that Mithras was born on December the 25th? Sure, but so what? The Gospels don't tell us when Jesus was born. Spring was the most likely time because shepherds were watching their flocks at night, and this is when ewes bore their young. Around AD 200, theologians got together and they concluded that Jesus was born on May 20th. Others believe that the date may have been in April or in March. It wasn't until the 4th century that December the 25th was chosen as the date to celebrate Jesus' birth, in part to bring a Christian influence to the pagan celebrations of the winter solstice. So right down the line, the supposed parallels disappear. Mithras didn't have 12 disciples. In the Iranian version, he had 1 follower. In the Roman version, he had 2. Mithras didn't sacrifice himself for world peace. He was known for killing a bull. And there are no records of any beliefs about the death of Mithras, and therefore no beliefs at all about a supposed resurrection. So this is what we find whenever we investigate claims of cases involving virgin births. For example, the mother of Alexander the Great, Olympias, rejected the story that he was conceived through Zeus. The Hindu god Krishna wasn't born of a virgin. His mother already had 7 previous sons, as his followers readily concede. As for Buddha, his early years are shrouded in mystery, but according to legends that developed 500 years later, Buddha's mother dreamed that he entered her in the form of a white elephant, fully formed. And get this, she had been married for many years prior to this, so she certainly wasn't a virgin. One of the most frequently cited parallels to the Jesus account is the story of Dionysus. He was a god of wine and fertility. He was also known as Bacchus. I asked the historian Edward Yamauchi for his analysis of that mythological story, and he told me this, quote, "No," he said, "there's no evidence of a virgin birth for Dionysus. As the story goes, Zeus, disguised as a human, fell in love with the princess Semele, the daughter of Cadmus, and she became pregnant. Hera, who was Zeus's queen, arranged to have her burned to a crisp, but Zeus rescued the fetus and sewed him into his own thigh until Dionysus was born." So, this is not a virgin birth in any sense. I asked Yamauchi about the story of Zeus impregnating Dania through a shower of gold and her giving birth to Perseus. Yamauchi told me there are many stories about Zeus and his liaisons with human women. Here's the big difference. The Jewish God, Yahweh, could be anthropomorphic, but these were metaphors not to be taken literally. Whereas in Greek mythology, the anthropomorphism was taken quite literally. The gods were very human. They lusted after mortal women. That's the focus of these myths. Although Yahweh is sometimes expressed in human imagery, he is utterly unlike human beings. So these parallels break down on a very fundamental level. You're talking about 2 very different concepts of God. The prominent scholar J. Gresham Machen of Princeton Theological Seminary makes a similar point in his magnum opus called The Virgin Birth of Christ. He says, quote, "Zeus may have had union with Dania, not in human form, but in a shower of gold, but all the same, the union is a satisfaction of his lust for the human maid. Everywhere it is the love of the God for the mortal woman, and not merely the exclusion of a human father of the child, which stands in the forefront of interest. And then he asks this question, which has an obvious answer. Could anything be more utterly remote from the representation in Matthew and Luke than these stories of the amours of Zeus? He later provides his own answer when he reaches his final conclusion on the topic. He says, quote, "There seems to be no clear evidence that pagan sources use the word virgin as referring to the mothers of heroes, mythical or historical, who were represented as being begotten by the gods." I'll mention one other major difference between the account of Jesus' birth and these other mythological or historical stories that are claimed to be parallels. Those other births always represent the beginning of that person's life. But that wasn't true of Jesus. He has existed from eternity past, and his birth merely represents his incarnation into flesh and blood. In other words, he didn't begin to exist at Christmas. He has always existed, and there's no other story that comes close to matching this important distinction. Now, some of the promoters of the mythology theory like to point out that the Christian apologist Justin Martyr, in the middle of the 2nd century, seemed to suggest that Jesus and the mythological Perseus share a virgin birth in common. See, the critics say, even early Christians saw the link. However, when you read what Justin Martyr actually wrote, you can see this is just a misunderstanding of what he was saying. You see, Justin Martyr was trying to diffuse Roman attacks on the church, because at the time, the Romans were severely persecuting Christians. So Justin was telling the emperor, look, you don't persecute people who worship other gods who are similar, so why persecute Christians? He was actually saying to his pagan opponents, you hold that the virgin birth of Christ is unbelievable. Well, is it any more unbelievable than the stories that you believe yourselves? He wasn't actually equating the virgin birth of Jesus with the birth of Perseus. He was merely using a rhetorical flourish to undermine the arguments of his opponents. What's more, many of these supposed virgin births don't occur until after Christianity. So if there was any borrowing, it would have been in the other direction. For instance, Zoroaster lived hundreds of years before Christ, but the idea that his mother conceived him by consuming a sacred drink doesn't appear until 900 years after Jesus. And even if some stories did come before Jesus, that doesn't mean they influence Christianity. After all, Christianity is rooted in Judaism, which is a religion that strongly resisted the incorporation of pagan beliefs. It's a logical fallacy to say that just because something occurred earlier, it necessarily influenced something later. For example, Plato wrote about the existence of God a long time before the Apostle Paul. But the Apostle Paul never depended on the Greek philosopher in writing his epistles. What I discovered in my investigation is that these legends bear no resemblance to the incarnation of Jesus. They are generally mythological tales about gods desiring mortal women who give birth to half-human, half-divine heroes who have the same weaknesses and the same sins as we do. That's in stark contrast to the accounts about Jesus. The truth is that proponents of these myth theories often mistranslate texts, they lift quotations out of context, and they use Christian terminology and imagery to try to force parallels where none exist. And that's not just the conclusion of conservative Christian scholars. Thomas Boesluper, who was a liberal professor who wrote a book on the virgin birth, even though he personally doubted whether it was historical, he nevertheless scoffed at the suggestion that the virgin birth was derived from pagan myths. His conclusion was really scathing. Let me quote it to you. Contemporary writers invariably use only secondary sources to verify such claims. The scholars whose judgments they accept rarely produced or quoted the primary sources. The literature of the old German school of religion, which has become the authority for contemporary scholars who wish to perpetuate the notion that the virgin birth in the New Testament has a non-Christian source, is characterized by brief word, phrase, and sentence quotations that have been lifted out of context or incorrectly translated and used to support preconceived theories. Sweeping generalizations based on questionable evidence have become dogmatic conclusions that cannot be substantiated on the basis of careful investigation. Another leading scholar told me this, quote, "I don't think anyone can make a convincing case that the virgin birth of Jesus, which is reported quite soon after the fact and in documents that are sober in their reporting, was derived from any pagan or other sources." And one of America's premier New Testament scholars, Raymond E. Brown, who taught at Union Theological Seminary in New York for 23 years, came to this conclusion, quote, "No search for parallels has given us a truly satisfactory explanation of how early Christians happened upon the idea of a virginal conception. Unless, of course, that is what really took place." I love the way he put that. We can't identify any way that this idea of a virgin birth could have been imported into Christianity. So where would it have come from? Unless that's what actually occurred. Friends, the bottom line is this. The reports of Jesus' birth, his teachings, his death, and his resurrection appear in a historical context. They're based on eyewitness accounts and are recorded virtually immediately after his life. They bear the earmarks of authenticity. They aren't the kind of flights of fancy that are found in mythological tales. So when we celebrate Christmas, we can be confident we're commemorating the birth of the unique Son of God, who came on a mission to seek and save those who are spiritually lost. I remember when I was a kid, I came running down the stairs on Christmas morning to see what Santa Claus had left me under the tree, and I tripped. And as I fell forward, my arms flailed as I desperately tried to grab the air as if the air was somehow going to break my fall, which of course it couldn't. Now, I was lucky I wasn't badly hurt, but you know what I was thinking? That's a bit what it's like when we try to grab a hold of legends and make-believe and wishful thinking and even fake news. They can't save us and they can't support us. Instead, we need to anchor our lives in something solid. And that's what the Word of God is. It isn't mythology, it's reality. It's based on truth. So this Christmas season, it's a good time to ground ourselves once more in the Scriptures. You know, mythologies begin with phrases like, once upon a time. They're not rooted in history. They don't claim to be based on eyewitness testimony. They're like bedtime stories meant to entertain or teach a lesson. But that's not what the New Testament is like. On the contrary, the Apostle Peter writes in 2 Peter 1:16, "For we did not follow cleverly devised tales." In other words, we didn't follow fairy tales or mythology when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of His majesty. And the Apostle John declares this in 1 John 1:1, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched. This we proclaim concerning the word of life. Now, that's the kind of truth that we can confidently anchor our lives in.